to talk about assumptions that are common in piano lessons. And I'm going to start with the big one, which is the assumption that if you take piano lessons, you will learn piano. All of the assumptions I want to talk about are ultimately limiting for our entire culture. I've been saying this a lot for the last couple of years, that piano lessons don't teach people piano. And I've been waiting for someone to convince me that I'm wrong. I would love to be wrong about this. And I have not heard any good rebuttals yet. Of course, we all know people who took piano lessons and learned piano. I'm one of those people. A lot of my friends are those people. Sometimes people learn things in piano lessons. But is that the norm? Most of the time when I talk to an adult who had piano lessons as a kid, they have some story about how they just didn't take to it. Or they have something negative tinged to say about the experience. Like, I took piano lessons, but I never learned to read. Those experiences are so saddening to me, because if everybody who took piano lessons learned piano, I believe we would have a much richer musical society. If anybody thinks learning piano is the norm for piano lessons and not the exception, I would love to hear stories about that. So now I want to go into some of the whys that I think that's the case. For one, it's an assumption in this culture that reading music is necessary and should be done early in the music learning process in order for the learning to be good. I don't know why we have to qualify it that way, but so many people have this unrelenting assumption that learning music starts with reading, and that reading music is the core of learning music. And, you know, I'm right there with many piano teachers. I used to teach reading first from the very first lessons. Most piano method books that teachers use start on page 1 with something about reading music, like finding middle C on the staff or learning to recognize a quarter note. Well, guess what, folks? Those things ain't music. They're symbols. And when we start people from the first lessons engaging their visual cortex, their visual processing, it short circuits the learning process. A cheesy guy says, I learned a little piano, I learned to read some notes. Well, that's so interesting. I mean, that goes along with what I said about how reading is incorporated so early in the learning process. But I also see maybe some discounting of the learning. I learned a little piano, I learned to read some notes. And I just wonder, well, I don't wonder because I've done the experiments and I know for a fact, reading early in lessons does not produce optimal outcomes. The visual cortex, visual processing is a brain hog. When that is engaged in the process of learning to recognize symbols on a page, when we're thinking of learning to read a little bit as the foundation for musical skills, all other musical skill development is short-circuited. Because, as I was saying, visual processing is a hog. The foundation of music learning is developing a listening vocabulary. For example, what does this chord sound like in relation to this chord? That's a sound. And if we're trying to learn to recognize that as that's an A, that's a E, or is it a B? We never get anywhere. That's an underlying assumption of music lessons that needs to change. Reading music should not be a priority of early lessons. I don't know that it should ever be a priority. Not for everyone, anyway, because there are many fields and genres of music where music reading is just not so important. Now, the thing is, for some people, reading music is useful. Professionals. And even amateurs, and I use amateur in the best sense of the word because ama means loving. So an amateur is someone who loves music. So I support that wholeheartedly. But the thing is, learning to read music should be similar maybe to the way we learn to read language. And for many of us, when we learn to read language, it just kind of happens organically. And it always happens after we've learned a listening vocabulary and a performance vocabulary. So for language, the performance vocabulary is like speaking and having conversations. Now, I'm talking about the way we learned our first language. Obviously, sometimes when we learn a second language, sometimes we do attempt to learn the reading part of it early. But just like with music, I think it usually fails. I mean, I had a couple years of Spanish in high school, and, we were learning from a book. I don't remember much, if anything, from that. I had a couple years of German in college, same idea, learning from a book, visual cortex engaged. That learning was not really learning. So music can be learned in an organic way. Continuing with the assumptions. There's the assumption that we all need to practice our scales because scales are where chords come from. And of course we all want to play chords, so you better learn your scales. That assumption is flawed in a few ways. Scales are an abstraction. Chords are something that we can learn to hear early on. As a matter of fact, scales come from chords, which is exactly the opposite of what most music teachers will tell you. But what I notice is that so many music teachers will tell you how things ought to be done, but they never make the connection with what and how students have learned. There's always this, I do this with my students, but they never connect that with, I do this, students learn this. And to complete the sentence of, I teach all my students scales, the other side of that is, a lot of my students quit before their third year. They didn't enjoy it. They didn't really learn those scales, and they didn't really learn to do anything useful with their own personal music. Cheesy Guy says, I taken 2 piano classes at my community. My instructor talked about scales too. Yes, exactly. I'm not making this stuff up. These assumptions are culture-wide about the things that are fundamental for piano lessons. And they're not fundamental, they're a distraction, and they're ultimately limiting. Because if you're thinking you're going to take piano lessons and learn piano by learning reading first and by learning scales, learning piano is not what happens. Most piano students quit and become uninterested in playing piano. So let me show you how it's the opposite. So what is this? So this is a Dorian. We could talk about the theory behind a Dorian chord progression, but theory isn't helpful. But the sound is something you can recognize. The true fundamentals of learning piano are based in sound. When you learn a vocabulary of tonal patterns and rhythm patterns, those are the things that allow students to build. Whereas when we start on these assumptions that reading needs to come first and scales need to come before chords, well, I keep having this analogy in my mind of, like, that's the top half of the ladder. Like, if you could imagine the music teacher being on the roof, and I think they want to be helpful, but they dangle down the top half of the ladder. And then there's the student on the ground who feels like they want to get up there, but there's no way to effectively start that journey because the lowest rung is up there. So that's what I want to change about how music lessons are done. My piano teacher taught us by playing what he was teaching. Okay, so there's some usefulness to that. So it sounds like he would play something and then students would learn to imitate that. Well, yeah, imitation is an important part of the music learning process. But what if it stopped there? And it sounds like maybe it did, and it often does stop there. I mean, what if your language learning stopped with your ability to imitate sentences? Your ability to communicate and express yourself would be sorely limited if that were the case. And that's the case with music too. If you're taught by imitation and it stops there, you're not going to be able to grow from that. So here we have some teachers are holding down the top half of the ladder, trying to teach music reading and scales without teaching students how to get to the first rung, and that's not helpful. Then we've got other teachers who are teaching through imitation, and that's like the bottom half of the ladder, but that only gets you up a few rungs. But there's this gap in the middle that teachers are not effectively filling. So I'm going to go into this question about Rick Beato, because I love talking about Rick Beato. But later on in this live, I'm going to talk about what I'm doing to give you the complete ladder so you can get started in an effective way, which includes some imitation, but it goes beyond that to improvisation. Because for music to become like a complete and full breakfast, you need the full ladder. Rick Beato is very skilled and very knowledgeable. I often enjoy watching his videos. He's obviously a very skilled performer. Has he studied the learning processes of students? I don't think so. I think maybe he had some pedagogy classes when he was in music school, but I think pedagogy classes in music school missed the boat in a lot of ways. Even in great conservatories, I went to Eastman School, that's one of the best music schools in the world, but even in the great conservatories, pedagogy classes are usually taught from a perspective of, this is what you should teach. You future teachers of the world, this is what you should teach. Which sounds harmless, but it's not. There's a simple change in perspective that revolutionizes music studios wherever it's taken. And that change of perspective is this: not to focus on what do I have to teach, but how does my student learn? And again, that may not sound like such a revolutionary thing, but it is. Think about it. When many of us grow up with music lessons and go to music school like I did, and many people do, that entire experience, we're generally self-centered. I don't mean that as a necessarily bad thing. That's just how it is. Even in our early music lessons, sometimes we're nervous or we want to make our teachers happy. That's self-centered. We're thinking a lot about ourselves. And that's kind of the nature of people. I mean, we do have egos. I have a huge ego. But the thing is, if it's still about me when I'm teaching, that's going to be a big limitation on my effectiveness as a teacher. My effectiveness as a teacher depends on my ability to understand where my student is in their learning process. When I'm being an effective teacher, it's not about me. I can't be self-centered. It's about my student. Yeah, and I have similar issues with Adam Neely. So Adam Neely is a very intelligent musician and a very skilled musician. But when it comes to being an effective teacher, that's like the baseline. B-A-S-E, baseline. I mean, my own personal skills and my own personal knowledge as a musician are not all that's required of me by my students, because it's not about me. My students need to be becoming self-sustainable musicians so that they're learning to learn. You know, our chief thing that we're teaching isn't to help kids know everything that I know. It's to help kids learn how to learn. And when we can set students up to learn, then they'll be learning for a lifetime, long after I'm gone. That's such a beautiful, humbling thought to me. It's like the kid that I helped learn how to sing that would likely have been tone deaf for the rest of his life if I didn't help him. He'll be a musician long after I'm dead because I took the time to do that. What does MLT stand for? Music learning theory. So it's based on a lot of stuff. So there's Piaget's learning theory. So someone named Edwin Gordon, a researcher who died a few years ago, but he was a prolific author. Edwin Gordon applied Piaget's learning theory and started music learning theory, which is also based on a lot of well-known pedagogues, Orff, Kodai, Suzuki, and I think builds on and improves upon those earlier pedagogues. So MLT is music learning theory, and I've read a lot of Edwin Gordon's works, and for my money, it's the most cohesive set of ideas and skills that students need to learn. And I think it should be like a best practices for music teachers. The bottom line for MLT, music learning theory, is what do we need to learn in order to know something else? So it's all about stair-stepping. And when we use these ideas from this research with students, students actually become very engaged in their lessons, with which musical engagement is something that's very rare in normal piano lessons. Normal piano lessons are kind of more like obedience school. Teachers tell students what to do and expect them to do it and get frustrated and disappointed when they can't. That's not good teaching. With music learning theory, students come to understand that what they're learning in any given week is the preparation for what they're going to learn next week. And they also start to see how they're building on what they learned the previous week. So this logical sequencing is very critical for students to learn music. Very cool. It takes a lot of perspective to teach. Perspective and research. So that's one of the strengths of music learning theory, is that this was based on countless lessons conducted by Dr. Gordon and his team of researchers. The question they're answering is, how do we learn music when we do learn music? Which again speaks to the assumption that I was talking about earlier in this broadcast. We have this assumption that if you take piano lessons, you'll learn piano. But I think most people that take piano lessons don't learn piano. I think maybe 15% do. Roughly corresponding with the 15% of people who have high music aptitude. That's the percentage of people who are probably going to learn music no matter what, because some people are wired with high music aptitude. But that leaves about 85% of people with average aptitude or low aptitude that traditional piano lessons don't have an answer for and don't have any help for. And I think the cost of that in terms of our culture and our society and our people is tragic. I was talking yesterday with a good friend of mine, a young person, an oboist. She just got her master's in oboe, and she's taken some time off to take care of herself. And I applaud her for doing that. Why is that necessary? Our music educational infrastructure, from the younger ages on through the conservatories, there is such a high cost in terms of always feeling like we have to be perfect to make our teachers happy. There was a lot of collateral damage when I was going to Eastman. I mean, I'm talking about people who developed severe psychological issues because of the way music is taught. And that's disappointing. I'm changing that. My course, Play and Sing in Harmony. Thomas says, isn't it crazy to think that back in the day, most households had a piano and a pianist? Yeah, and I kind of lived through the last days of that. You probably didn't, because you're younger than significantly younger than me. How did I get old? I don't know. I think there's as many keyboards around as ever. Now, obviously, I'm partial to acoustic pianos. That's what I was trained on, and I spent a lot of years honing my technique to make the most of the tonal variety that I can get from an acoustic instrument. But so many people have digital instruments now. Like, especially if I think about people who produce their own music on a DAW using a keyboard controller. There's never been a better time for piano teachers. But piano teachers don't know what they're doing by and large. Often, some of them. Many, I don't know about most, many piano teachers, if they knew how to teach better, they would. However, I've found that many piano teachers are very reactionary. And when they're approached with the idea that they can learn to teach better, they get defensive and start talking about, well, I do this, I do this, I do it this way, I do it this way. But they don't make the connection that, yeah, I do it that way. And then after a couple of years, my students quit and they never want to play piano again. You know, without that connection, people don't get the whole picture. I engage with lots of singing and movement activities in my piano lessons. And therefore, my students become engaged with music in a way that they start learning music from the inside out. And then applying what they've learned to the piano becomes very organic, easy, dare I say fun, but it's effective. Thomas says, yeah, I think if I didn't have a musical theater background, my piano trajectory would be a lot different. I can't imagine not having a musical background and having started piano with C scales. Yeah. You know, what a great way to help students fail is to start to teach them with a C major scale. Yes, I made that rhyme. But Thomas, I got a bone to pick with you. Yeah, so Thomas, before I came on this live, I saw your video with the sight reading, which, I mean, good for you for posting a video of it. You're spending time at the piano, and I think that's generally helpful. Reading is one of the assumptions I mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast, as even though it's a cultural assumption that learning to read music early on is fundamental to learning music, it's the opposite. Developing that mindset early on that reading is just this super important, great thing is limiting. It halts us from developing our vocabularies. Ideally, when we've taken an appropriate learning sequence and we're learning rhythm patterns and tonal patterns, we're learning a vocabulary, then reading can happen kind of automatically. Similar to the way for many of us learning language, reading just kind of happens automatically after we've been listening and talking for a while. I know that's not true for everybody. Some people do need to take extra steps to learn reading. But even there, in the field of language, but even in terms of language, there's a sense of propriety attached with reading that's not helpful for people. There's these reading recovery programs that students will go into, students who have been having difficulties reading, and they focus on reading. So the kids will go into these long 30-minute sessions and just read. And the thing is, after a year or so, they look like they're doing better, according to test scores. But after multiple years, they're not doing better. They're actually doing worse than their peers. And this is exactly what I see with piano lessons. Piano teachers put this focus on reading. And I don't want to put all the blame on piano teachers either. A lot of the blame has to go with piano parents. Piano parents, I love you, but you're not music teaching experts. Piano parents often ask, will my kid learn to read? And I don't know why that's become such a primal kind of thing. But it's absolutely inappropriate to focus on that. It's ineffective to focus on that before kids have developed their music vocabularies. I mean, just imagine taking a baby who isn't even talking yet and trying to teach them to read, they're not going to be better with language. They're going to be worse. So Thomas, you posted that video about sight reading, and you're such a good player. You were down on yourself. You said, I suck at sight reading. I don't know. I just hope I can spark some kind of mindset that, you know, if you're working on something, but you're also thinking, I suck at it, that's not engagement. That's looking for opportunities to beat yourself up about something. And there are better ways to grow, and you deserve better ways to grow. Didn't learn to play well till I was in college. Yeah, when teaching is more appropriate for young students, then they don't have to wait till they're in college to be good. Yes, but in terms of learning a piece, what are your opinions on memorization? I do way better. Yeah, memorizing quickly, then I feel like I can add the musicality. Well, I don't agree with that last sentence. Then I feel like I can add the musicality. I mean, again, just compare it to language. I mean, you don't practice sentences and then when I get into a conversation, I can add the emotion to it. I mean, think how weird that would be, or how unusual that would be. I mean, I don't think the musicality is something to be added. I think it's something intrinsic. So if you're learning a piece separate from the musicality, I don't think that's going to get you where you want to be. Probably more useful to break it down. Like if it's a big Rachmaninoff or something, something not sight readable for most of us, including me, maybe play the melody, maybe play a bass line, but always in context, always with musicality, I think, but always in the tonal context. What's the tonality? What are the tonal patterns? What's the meter? What are the rhythm patterns? I memorize quickly too. I don't enjoy reading. I mean, I have to learn how to do it. But again, the stuff that I'm best at reading is the stuff for which I've developed a huge listening and performing vocabulary. I can read pop and rock tunes. I can read church music because I worked in church for a long time. So I knew that sound. And that's not even particularly music that I like, but I knew the sound and I had the vocabulary. That's the key. If you have the listening vocabulary and the performance vocabulary, learning to read it is easy. Again, almost exactly analogous to language reading. If we're talking about words that I've heard and used in conversation, that's not going to be a big deal for me to read. In Orpheus 79, I taught myself to sight read. I don't like the term sight read. Because what other kind of reading is there? You smell reading? With the well-tempered clavier at 20. Who learns to read with the well-tempered clavier? So you must be high aptitude indeed. Or you weren't reading so well. Perhaps you were decoding. I don't know. Something to consider. But yeah, if for anybody else watching, I would not recommend well-tempered clavier as reading practice for sure. I wish my early focus had been theory. Well, I'm not going to agree with you on that. Theory is one of the other assumptions that the culture has as being so vitally fundamental to music, and it ain't. Again, analogous to language. You don't have to learn language theory to have a conversation. You don't have to learn music theory to play music. No harm in anyone who wants to go to college and learn language theory. That's fine. Same with music. No harm necessarily in going on to learn music. But you don't learn language theory unless you're already having conversations. It's ineffective to attempt to learn music theory before you're already doing music. If you want to sight read, you have to sit and do it. Yeah, I don't know. People like to beat themselves up and flagellate themselves. I don't think anybody wants to sight read. I think people want to play music. And when it comes down to it, how is poor reading distinguishable from poor music skills? Really odd to me how those things have become so intertwined. How about forget about your reading and play better? Well, that's why I love improvising. Yeah, improvising is vital to the learning process. And get to flex that jazz side of my brain, but classical sight reading is an unfortunately necessary evil, only because we perpetuate it being so. And I also want to point out that improvisation shouldn't be limited to jazz. Classical musicians were great improvisers as well. But in a more forward-looking way, we need to be helping students find their future musical voices instead of looking backwards. So one way to do that is when they're learning their pattern vocabulary. They might learn a rhythm pattern like do, to do, to do, today, do. So they should, and adults can do, kids and adults should improvise with patterns. So improvisation with that pattern could be as simple as I mean, that wasn't jazz. Probably sounded kind of modern classically and probably not anything anybody would buy. So what? By improvising with the rhythm pattern, you gain ownership of it. By gaining ownership of it in performance, then you can learn to read it. Ba, 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 ba. Sight reading is a stupid word. There, I said it. You need to learn to play musically as you memorize. Yeah, I need to learn to play musically as you memorize. It's always built into the muscle memory. But muscle memory isn't a thing. WTC is aggressive. What? Can you elaborate on decoding? Yeah, decoding. I mean, can you imagine reading a book letter by letter? Letters don't have meaning. If you're reading a book letter by letter, that's not really reading, it's decoding. And similarly, when you're attempting to play a piece of music by decoding pitch after pitch or duration after duration, that's not reading, it's decoding. The analog for words in music would be tonal patterns and rhythm patterns. Reading means you have to have a vocabulary of those. Theory itself is a language. Theory is not a language. Theory is describing music that someone else has already made. And it could be useful for that, but not necessary for making music. Chord theory, not necessary. Theory describes after the fact. Practice. Practice in the sense of what are we actually doing? Even young students can recognize chords in a tonal context, and that should come before the theory. The music should be dynamic. Theory is not so dynamic. It's a very needed skill. Sight reading. I tried to accompany numerous people, other music majors, and I had to sight read to do that. Yeah. I mean, if that's the job, collaborating with others and yeah, there are some jobs for which reading is required. When we attempt to make reading a primary skill from the earliest lessons, that doesn't increase the musicality of the culture, it cripples it. I think he's saying, though, that you had to already speak the language to be able to do that. Yeah, that's right. I was thrown to the wolves, and it was very nerve-wracking. Yeah, I've been there. I've had nerve-wracking jobs because I had to read hard stuff. I don't want anybody else to be thrown to the wolves. I mean, I think sometimes the attitude is, I had a trial by fire, therefore the trial by fire is the right way to learn music, and therefore I'm going to expose my students to a trial by fire. And that's it's a little bit hateful, and it's a lot ineffective. So do I think that students need a very solid foundation and knowledge of the piano orally before they even touch a piece of music? Well, the oral understanding and the pattern vocabulary doesn't start with the piano. It starts with singing and moving. Singing is the way we develop our tonal pattern vocabulary, and movement is how we develop our rhythm pattern vocabulary. For effective learning, students learn that vocabulary, then they bring it to the piano. They never have to develop that idea that this is scary. Maybe they recognize bum bum bum, ba-da-dum, bum bum, bum bum bum. When you're thinking in terms of tonal patterns, the tonic function, do, mi, re, of chord functions, then the piano becomes kind of incidental. You're bringing your audiation instrument to your technical instrument. And audiation skills can be taken to any instrument. So that's why the audiation instrument is the first lesson that we should be teaching. Before they even touch a piano. Work on Jeux. Great. So, I mean, good for you. I don't know. I just confused on the order of operations with... Oh, before they even touch a piece of music. Well, I wouldn't think of touching a piece of music. I don't think it's useful to think of the written music as music. When they're improvising with patterns, that's the music too. But yeah, their pattern vocabulary needs to be there. Their performance, they need to have learned to make a connection between their performance vocabulary and keyboard geography and technique, and then reading might happen. Reading still doesn't click for everyone, and that's okay. A lot of great musicians, way better than any of us, don't read. For some people, it doesn't click, but that's okay. The order of operations with your method. Ask me more questions. I don't know if maybe I answered that, but maybe not. But as far as working on Jeux, like that doesn't tell anybody anything. I'm working on Jeux. What are you working on with it? How are you working on it? What do you want to say with it? I think that's the critical question, and that's certainly not a question that was ever addressed in my lessons. I kind of always thought, well, I'll keep going to my lessons, and one day I'll be good enough to have something to say with music. And that gets to the very heart of how these cultural assumptions about learning music are harmful. They don't help build a more musical culture with more musical individuals. They make it impossible. It's probably how dance and musical theater has helped me excel quickly at the piano. Yeah, it sounds like you're already audiating. You got a big listening vocabulary. You know what things sound like. And if you were singing and moving to it, you know what things felt like. So you developed your pattern vocabulary. Boom, yeah. Emily, somebody said something. I work technique mostly. You got to after you're audiating. You know, for years, I had so much technical ability, and I would tell my students how to do stuff, and it wouldn't stick. And now I understand it's because their audiation instrument hadn't been trained. So again, audiation training makes the technical instruction stick. Orpheus 79 says, what is audiating? Audiating is hearing music with comprehension. So listening is half of it. It's listening with comprehension, usually with specific regard to content in context. So with the music that you're hearing, by the way, whether it's physically present or not, it may be music that you're hearing in your head, but what's the tonal context? Is it major, minor, Dorian, something else? And what's the tonal content? What are the patterns? Is it Dorian, Re, Fa, La, Re, So, Ti? And then the same with rhythm and meter. What's the meter? Is it duple, triple, unusual, something else? And what are the rhythm patterns? That's the content in that meter context. Hey, Frank's here. Well, Frank, you're here for this, but it's almost over. I'm 3 minutes overtime right now, but I'll keep going for a few more minutes. I think people literally fight you in the comments of my video. Yeah, they do. This is truly a paradigm shift, and people are feeling validated. Yeah, but I think this is kind of fascinating. It's super fascinating to think about. And people who feel invalidated by thinking about different ways of learning, what's their reasoning for being so defensive? Because I don't think there's any escaping the conclusion that a lot of people fall through the cracks in music lessons. You know, it's like the opposite of No Child Left Behind. It's like with music lessons, most kids left behind. And it's very disappointing to me because the research is out there. When kids learn music, these are the steps they've gone through. But we have so many teachers not taking advantage of that research because they only know to teach the way they were taught. For those teachers who want to teach better, good. But for teachers who only want to defend the way that they have taught, and they're okay with so many students falling through the cracks, I want that to go away. Yeah, so people feeling invalidated because the things that they took for granted were actually wrong. I guess that's the crux of this whole broadcast when I'm talking about musical assumptions. The assumptions students come to their lessons with are limiting. And that's why I'm taking this approach national. I mean, I have my teaching studio here in North Carolina, but I realize that any new student I take, I'm going to spend maybe a year or two convincing their parents why we're singing and moving instead of learning middle C on the staff. It's because I care about your student, your kid, actually learning music and staying with music and engaging with music and not quitting after 2.5 years like most students do and never playing a piano again. It doesn't have to be that way. I mean, I think I have a friend of mine who did a lecture and he said, music is a human right. And I'll go along with that. I think one of the most powerful tools for fascism, here I go. This is what happens when I go overtime. One of the most powerful tools for fascism is convincing people that they don't have a voice and that they don't have something to say. And I don't want to say like music lessons are complicit with fascism, but it goes hand in hand. How many people learn to say something from within themselves, something meaningful and important musically? No, they think that they have to wait for that. And even with what you were saying earlier, Thomas, with the learn it and then add musicality, I think that speaks to what I'm talking about. I mean, musicality, that's what you have to say. That's what musicality is. In my opinion, that's what we should be teaching students from day one. That's more important than attempting to teach them to read music. Saying something with music is from the inside out. Attempting to learn to read music is learning that the instructions are out there, and if you can't follow them, there's something wrong with you. Quit piano after one lesson because it turns out my teacher didn't speak ADHD. What? Oh, this is so important. Frank, this is huge. If teachers want to further marginalize neurodivergent students, traditional piano lessons are a perfect way to do it. Because since I've studied the research on music learning theory, and lessons are truly about engaging with music instead of following orders, I've managed to be helpful for students who I know would have been not helped, possibly harmed by more traditional approaches. So, I mean, this has to do with ADHD and all sorts of other types of students who just seem to have maybe a hard time getting along with other people. Learning how the musical mind works invites people into music who don't think exactly like lots of other people. Music should be inviting those people. Art is so important. I mean, how boring would art be if everybody was normal? Teaching audiation is the way I hear and understand. Audiation for a student is the way they hear and understand. So when the whole context of our lessons is your individual understanding of music, your ADHD doesn't become a hindrance. It becomes a part of the way you understand in a way that you can embrace and feel more fully yourself instead of not good enough, which is what music lessons are usually teaching. My comments are hot sometimes. Yeah, because it's very disappointing. I mean, when I started teaching this way, I thought, whoa, everybody's going to love this. You know what? Parents don't always love it. Other teachers don't always love it. They're reactionary against it. But who does way better? My students. I mean, I've lost business because I teach this way. Since I understand that these limitations are out there and any new student I get, it's going to come to lessons limited by these assumptions. That's why I'm taking this out to everyone. I'm out to help the people who want to be helped. And for the teachers who don't want to change the way they do business, or the way they teach to better serve students. I want parents and adult students to understand that that ain't good teaching. It's lousy teaching. How best to translate your audiation technique to my most often sung style of a cappella bass on imitative style syllables for the bass groove. I mean, that sounds great. That doesn't sound like you need to translate my audiation technique. It sounds like you have an audiation technique. That's cool. Yeah, if you're using that with syllables, imitative style syllables. I don't know. Syllables can be useful as long as it shouldn't be stopping with imitation. Like imitation is the beginning of learning, but it should be stuff that you're able to improvise with and be flexible with, just like your language vocabulary. Do I have a course on audiation? Oh, yep, I answered that. There it is, Play and Sing in Harmony. The link is in the bio. Heck yeah, Musicality. The lessons that stuck with me were from a supervised correspondence course. Yay, cassette tapes. Well, in a way, my Play and Sing in Harmony course is kind of like a supervised correspondence course, because also for now, if you buy the course, Play and Sing in Harmony, you get a year of membership in the members-only Play and Sing Facebook group, which I check all the time. So when you run into challenges in the course, put the questions in the Facebook group. I'll answer them. You don't have to wait a week until your next lesson or whatever. And what's kind of beautiful about that is that if you're having a question or a difficulty with something, other people are too. So put your question in there, and I'm not just helping you by answering, I'm helping everybody. And other people benefit from, your own insights. If you post about something that you've learned or something that worked really well for you. Music lessons work best when we're all learning from each other. Students learn what to do from watching other students, and sometimes they learn what not to do from watching other students. So the one-on-one idea of private piano lessons is not very serving for students. The lessons, all right, okay, well, you've quelled any of my sight reading. Good! I've quelled Thomas Hoffman's sight reading self-esteem issues because, can I play piano now, please? I will in a minute. Thomas Hoffman, I had pretty terrible ADHD, but I appreciate my teacher forcing you to stay. I don't like the word force. Your music teacher is yourself. For me, I'm a guide. If I'm having to force a student to do something, something's not right there. There's something to be processed, something to be thought about. Can I play piano now, please? I will in a minute, maybe. Low burn, can, him. Like he kept me on the damn Bach Invention for months when I was itching to move on to Chopin. Oh, this is another thing I wanted to talk to you about, Thomas. 'Cause I think we were talking earlier about you learning big pieces and then kind of moving on. When it comes to developing skills, a lot of tiny pieces with one or two ideas is going to be a lot more useful than focusing on a huge piece for a few months with thousands of ideas you got to figure out. And also, Bach Inventions are hard. People say they're not, they're wrong. They are. Frank says, Thomas, I hear you. My problem is I can't find the on-off switch for my hyperfocus. Right. But wouldn't it be magical if that hyperfocus could be sighted onto musical skills that actually build? Like if your hyperfocus is focused on reading or some musical skill that you don't understand, you're going to become hyper-focused on failure and disappointment in yourself. But if you know where you're going and if you know the process, well, that sounds like it could be pretty powerful. Thomas Hoffman says, hey, that's same. That's why piano is an amazing antidote. It's truly a never-ending challenge. Yeah, but wouldn't it be nice if you didn't have to think of it as a challenge? You express yourself with words, but you don't constantly think of talking as a challenge. What if you could express yourself at the piano and not feel constantly challenged by it? I know how it works. I got a master's from Eastman. I'm familiar with challenges, but it's just when I look how this plays out culture-wide, I think we'd all be better off if more people were invited into music instead of being gate kept out of it. To finish the Bach before well, I disagree. You needed to finish the Bach before you moved on to Chopin. I mean, that's just more kind of like moralizing, like if you need to stop working on a piece, you can do it. I mean, if it's for a job, even if it's for a job, you can always quit a job. And quitting isn't always bad. You can trust yourself that maybe it's time to let go of something and do another thing. I do have an audiation technique, but it isn't consistent. Well, okay. So like my course up here would give you some consistency to it, at least in the area of tonality and tonal patterns. I'm going to do another course for meter and rhythm patterns later. But first I got to figure out how to sell this one, because it doesn't do anybody any good if nobody buys it. I'm not audiating my performance vehicles. My phone just doesn't recognize audiation. Yeah, oh yeah. When you said radiation, I knew exactly, or audiation, I knew exactly what you meant, because my phone has actually gotten pretty good at recognizing the word audiation, but it took a long time. And macro beats and micro beats, it's still working to figure out those words. Rote is like training wheels. You got to drop them pretty quickly. Yeah. So what works well in early lessons is when students learn a piece, they got to be able to play the original version. I mean, there's right and wrong, sort of, but they also need to be able to change it, like change one thing, thereby instilling the value that adding your voice is fundamental. But I think Rote is easy to grade. That's a good point. That's why it's prevalent in teaching scenarios. Unfortunately true, probably. I worked on the Tempest Sonata with her, the Rote teacher. She would play a phrase and wanted me to repeat it. Yeah, what a lousy way to teach. I mean, with that kind of teaching, the teacher is always the ceiling, and the student's always the weak link in the room. I prefer to think of it as I'm the floor. Students start their journey with what they learned from me. All right, I'm gonna do my whole spiel. My whole spiel was about assumptions. The cultural assumptions that are ultimately limiting to music students. Number one, we assume that if you take piano lessons, you'll learn piano. I think that's usually not the case. When most students take piano lessons, most of them don't learn. So the assumption that if you take music lessons, you're gonna learn music. Usually not true. Usually only true for high aptitude students. That's like the top 15 or 20%. Other assumptions that you need to learn to read music, and that enables all the other stuff. Totally backwards. Attempting to learn to read music before you've developed a vocabulary inhibits students, it hinders students, and it virtually assures that they will not go on to engage with music. Thomas says, thank you, Robert, for hanging around. Thoroughly enjoyed this live and picking my brain. That's fine. Just put it back when you're done with it. Also, yay, upstate New York, Ithaca College. All right. Did I ever go to Ithaca College for anything? I don't think so. But yeah, Eastman's in Rochester, so that's the connection there. Assumption that you got to learn scales so that you can learn chords. All these things that say you have to wait to do music are not necessary. That's not great teaching, it's bad teaching. You can learn the sounds of chord functions first and learn chords and improvise with chords. Then scales become meaningful. Scales come from chords. Scales are an abstraction. Scales are necessary. They're an important part of instrumental technique. But if you put them in the wrong order, they're a guarantee of failure. What else? That you have to learn music theory first. No, you don't. In the same way that you didn't have to learn language theory before you could tell your mama you were hungry. So the good news is there is good research out there about how to audiate music. And if you're interested in that, Google music learning theory. If you're interested in developing your tonal pattern vocabulary and applying it to the piano and improvising and playing by ear using those skills, which by the way is a foundation for reading, then use my course, Play and Sing in Harmony. I don't get into music reading in my course, but again, the tonal pattern vocabulary that you will develop in my course will support your future reading. Great talk. Thanks for the perspective. I got to go, but I'm going to look up MLT. Yeah, enjoy it. Be prepared for a wild ride. Play and sing in harmony. That's the name of my course. Link is in my bio. Somebody was asking me to play, but I don't see them here now. Are they still here? Nope, they are not here. So I don't feel obligated to play. I'm not your playing monkey. I don't really hadn't prepared anything anyway, but all right, see ya. All right, I'm gonna hop off too. This was wonderful, y'all. Thank you so much for participating. Enjoy your Memorial Day weekend, and I hope you all have as much fun as you possibly can. See ya.